Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. This is brought to us by the Convivencia Alliance, and it is Israel. How did we get to it? We have two distinguished speakers, Haim Bresheeth and Raef Zreik, and they will each speak for half an hour, and then we will open it for questions. I just want to ask everybody to please mute themselves and also turn off their video for the duration of the lecture. We would also like for people to remember that we will not be able to tolerate disruptions, and people who do disrupt, unfortunately, will have to be excluded. During the Q&A, we ask the people, especially if they want to ask a question, unmute themselves and also show the video, and that people send their questions to the chat where we will be able to interface them, and I will be able to give people the right to speak. To introduce myself, my name is Hagit Borer. I'm a professor of linguistics at Queen Mary University of London. I've been an activist for peace with justice, let's put it this way, in the Middle East for, it's coming on 50 years. And I have lectured on this, and I have written on this, and I have done a fair amount of activism on the topic. I am originally from Israel, and I now live in the UK. I wanted to just say a few words before I pass the podium, so to speak, to Haim Bresheeth, who would be our first speaker. And that is, as you will hear, I think, considerably at length from both of our speakers, that the crisis that is now unfolding in Israel, that crisis that has been going on for several months now, and which has been marked by pretty impressive demonstrations on both sides of the political spectrum, is, and is likely to remain a crisis that is marking the Jewish portion of the Israeli society. The main thing that is coming to the front now are divisions within the Jewish Israeli society that have been plaguing this society for many, many years. And they have come to a point of explosion. Those of us who do not necessarily, such as, let's say, Haim or myself or Raef, who are part of the Israeli society, but do not necessarily identify with either side of this particular conflict, because we are, we note with one of the most striking factors of these demonstrations, and that is that they, both sides cast themselves as patriotic Israelis and as proponents of the desire to have a Jewish state. The question is just what kind of Jewish state they desire, and the visions are extremely different and extremely conflictual. Many times during the history of the state of Israel, escalation of conflicts with Palestinians or with Arab countries have come to be enacted in order to enable very deep divisions within the Jewish society to be masked by the emergence of overriding national interest. And one of the very striking things about these particular demonstrations is that certain consensual beliefs about the civic national consensus within the Jewish society have been questioned. And so there's a lot of discussion that's been happening in radical circles on whether or not the result of these demonstrations would be to return to the status quo ante, which was very far from ideal, and I'm sure both of our speakers will address this issue. But I think that there are ways in which both sides have broken away with certain fundamental Jewish, Israeli, and Zionist myth There have been numerous, shall we say, sacred cows that have been slaughtered in the last several months. And it is not entirely clear that it is possible to return to the status quo ante, which is, at least in my humble opinion, perhaps already something. I wanted to just give a small example. The example are the Israeli pilots. Pilots within the Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, have been much revered and have enjoyed tremendously high status and lots of privileges. And they were untouchable. They were a section of the population that was completely untouchable. What is remarkable about this particular set of events that have taken place in the last few months is, first of all, that quite a few of the pilots have put themselves forth publicly as dissenting from the national interests as it is or may be expressed by the government of the State of Israel. They have declared that they would refuse to undertake missions for this government if the legislation that is proposed will go forth. But what is equally striking is that on the part of the supporters of the legal reform, there have been vicious attacks on those very same pilots. All of a sudden, things which have always been true, and that is that they're very privileged, that the State of Israel has invested millions in these individuals and have given them a lot of benefits at the expense of many other things. All of these things are all of a sudden coming to light, and it shows, I think it illustrates very, very clearly how this particular conflict is bringing out into the open, into the public domain, and into the discourse, contradictions within the Jewish society, which are very important. Just because of that, even though, as I'm sure both speakers will note, that big campaign on behalf of democracy that has been going on the part of the population that has been demonstrating in the major streets of major cities for the past 3 months, as is very well known, their notion of democracy is democracy for Jews. And that has delimited that campaign to begin with. But even within these very narrow parameters, I think a return to the status quo ante is not possible. And it is, at least to my mind, carries a little bit of promise with respect to the ability of things actually moving on and some real changes coming to be, not just with respect to the present government, but with respect to the reality of the State of Israel in the last 75 years. And I will now pass the floor to Haim Bresheeth. Haim Bresheeth is a filmmaker, a photographer, and film studies scholar, and a professional research associate at SOAS University of London. His books include the best-selling Introduction to the Holocaust with Stuart Hood, which was published in numerous languages. Edited volumes include The Gulf War and the New World Order, Cinema and Memory, Dangerous Liaisons, which is in Hebrew, The Conflict and Contemporary Visual Culture in Israel and Palestine. And most recently, a well-publicized book, An Army Like No Other, How the IDF Made Israel, that came out with Versa 2020. I pass the floor to Haim Bresheeth. Haim, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hagit, for the introduction, which I think saves some of our words for us now. Obviously, the three of us are not really keen on a Jewish state of any kind, because by definition, such a state is undemocratic. And Israel itself, Israel was never a democracy, so there's no democracy to save. I'm sure both of us will talk about that, but I'll go into some details later on. I want to describe the two sides to this conflict. First of all, what is this conflict really about? Supposedly, only about democracy, the judiciary selection, religionization, which is a bad description in English of the word hadata, which means enforcing religious rules and regulations. And about Netanyahu, these four issues supposedly are exclusively what this is about. You've noticed that the million or so Israeli flags that the opposition ordered in China are being heavily used. So both sides are claiming to be the real Israelis. What separates the sides actually got a lot of coverage. What actually is more important, I would argue, is what they agree on, because that is what is important to Palestinians and those of us who support the Palestinians. Now, as an old-time Marxist, I think that what shapes people is what they do. The practices that they are involved in will determine the consciousness, the ways of thinking, the whole world of thought that they are using. And in this case, the Israelis are settler colonialists, always have been, even before the state of Israel. And therefore, their practice, which is a militarized practice, and you will, of course, know that if you want to be a settler colonialist, you have to be militarized, because otherwise you can't enforce all the things that the Israelis enforce. Therefore, I think there is an important place for the army in this conflict, as it is in any other part of Israeli going on. And my book on the IDF is making the case throughout. We can ask, why now? Why has this exploded all of a sudden without signs beforehand? Well, the signs were there all right, but most people didn't see them. The ascent of the new elite did not start in January. The ascent of the new elite started with the Begin government. And these things are historical processes, and they take decades, of course. And therefore, I would like to present the timing as the point that the new elite has arrived. The new form of Zionism has arrived and is with us and is powerful. And first of all, it's powerful enough to run the government and to publish all that they are planning to do. And I have put into the chat a very interesting link. Please don't read it now. It's 17,000 words or so. But I have translated a paper that Smotrich has, Smotrich, the Minister of National Security now, a fascist, he is a proud fascist, and not just a fascist. And he wrote in 2017 a Hebrew article in an extreme right-wing publication called Hashiloach. No way to translate this into English, really. And there he argued for the second Nakba, basically. Please use this link. I think he adjusted some of the sentences where he became a minister in January. So my translation is of the second version, which is trying to hide some of the nasty sides of the plan, yet it's very nasty. It's nasty enough. So first, who are the opposition? What do they stand for? Who they? Where do they live? Where do they come from? Well, the old elite, you could call them the children of Ben-Gurion, are mainly in the conurbation of the Tel Aviv area. If in Britain we have the same percentage in the Greater London area, that will be 32 million people. At the moment, it's less than 13. So this is a very, very large and very powerful conurbation. It controls the economy, it controls the academy, it controls the army, it controls culture, it controls media, you could go on, the arts, etc. And despite all the efforts of the new elite, they have not managed to dislodge that measure of control in most of those areas. Some they have in the media, for example, on television, etc., but not in most of them. Definitely not in the army, which we'll come to later on. So this is this conurbation that is basically ruling the country. It's producing most of the income. It produces most of the exports. It produces the military-industrial complex is in its hands, as is most of the high-tech industry. So these people are, a lot of them, army officers, either in long term or in the reserves. Most of the high-ranking officers of the IDF are Ashkenazis, like those in the opposition. I should also mention the kibbutz movement. It's lock, stock, and barrel behind the opposition. And if you just look at who speaks at the meetings of the opposition, it's all the generals who should be in the ICC at The Hague. And they keep saying, and Moshe Ya'alon was the first that said it, if the reform that Netanyahu is pushing passes, me and all my friends and also your sons and fathers will be in The Hague. Now, I think this is probably optimistic, but this is what they are worried about. One of the things that they are very much worried about, that the fact that they are war criminals, any way you look at it, and that they have done this for decades, will bring them to The Hague. So these are the people who speak to the demonstrators and who see all those seas of flags in the wind. So this is very interesting to start with. This population has very good links with the West, of course, with the US, with the EU, with Canada, Australia, etc. A lot of them actually, as academics or professionals, work occasionally in other countries, and a lot of them plan to move, they say, if the reform passes. What do they want? Law and order is one of the first things that is on their lists, because they have written the laws and the laws benefit them. Therefore, it's very crucial for them that the law shall not change and the judiciary shall not change. They have appointed the judiciary. It is a mirror image of themselves, an elevated mirror image, and they will do anything not to agree that it changes character or makeup. How do they see the current situation? Well, the main thing that you can identify in all the expressions is we built the state. Israel is a child of our effort. Even if they are very young, they feel that they built the state because their father or grandfather was there at the time. And they won't give up control. And they won't give up to give up identity is the most difficult thing. I'm sure everyone realizes that on this meeting. And they won't give up their identity as the powerhouse of Israel. And therefore they are fighting, and they're fighting like, I think longer than the Ukrainian events in 2014. And this is not reported fully in the same way that Ukraine was reported at the time, because I think they are worried about the Israeli state not liking the reporting. So the BBC, for example, is very bad at not reporting this, actually. Now, there are some changes that happened that are at the heart of this campaign. One of them is a religious change. Like the new elite that took decades to come in, this has taken a very long time. But just two figures. In 1948, less than 15% of Jewish Israelis were religious of any kind. According to the Pew Institute in 2016, which is the last time they published the report, more than half of the Israeli population consider themselves religious. Some of them are, of course, ultra-Orthodox, some of them are Reform, some of them conservative, and so on. But the figure today is closer to 2/3. This is an encroachment on the people who are in the streets. Because they understand that they have become not only the old elite, but they have become a minority, and they don't like it. How did this happen? I don't have time to go into now, and I'm sure you know something about that. Now, because Israel is never been a democracy, these people are not democratic. They will not admit equality with the Palestinians, of course. They would not admit equality with the Mizrahim, with the Ethiopians. I'm not talking about, people who are looking for a home because they're, from Africa or Asia and they are refugees. Of course not. Now, I want to talk very briefly about the army. Much more in my book. The officer class of that army is mainly Ashkenazi. They are highly educated, as the rest of the Ashkenazi population. And they are running the army, and especially the fighting units. The rest of the IDF is Mizrahi, Ethiopian, and Druze. They man the interface with the occupation, mainly. Of course, also the fighting units, the elite units, in other words, killing squads, are mainly Ashkenazi. So this is something to put on your CV when you leave the army, yeah? So this is the opposition in outline. Quickly, I'll go through the government supporters. Remember that Herzl, Jabotinsky, Begin, Shamir, Sharon, Olmert, Netanyahu come all from a right-wing liberal tradition of privatization, of private capital, of this minimal state, and so on. Not always do they do what they say. For example, the state is not minimal ever in Israel. So we can say that they are children of Herzl and Jabotinsky, as opposed to the others, the children of Ben Gurion. They are the sorry. They are the new elite is the main body that ruled Israel since 1979. About 4/5 of the period, we had right-wing extreme government led by Begin, Shamir, Olmert, Sharon, and Netanyahu. All of them are right-wingers of an extreme type. So no one serving in the army knows what a country that doesn't occupy is like. Actually, even the parents don't know that, because their parents were born after 1979 and served in an occupation army. A lot of them are ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox or religious. I think something like half are, at least half. A lot of the others are Mizrahim, settlers, and fascists of the new type that now rules the roost. All those points, all those divisions, of course, are interlaced. So, you know, you have fascist religious people, and you have Mizrahim who are, you know, liberal right, and so on. The makeup is actually less homogeneous than the opposition. I described the opposition. Most of them are Mizrahim, even in the religious field, but they include lower middle class, working class. They are less educated. They're centered in the Jerusalem area, and the ring of steel, which is surrounding Jerusalem with settlements. And they have been not supportive of the law, because the legal system has limited limited their opportunities and denied them others. So it's understandable that they don't think that this system is perfect for them. Like other Israelis, they're militaristic, chauvinistic, and racist. I don't think I need to persuade you of that. And they, in the main, support halacha law, which is the religious law, instead of the secular law, which now runs Israel. They are an ascendant class, and they are very strongly anti-socialist, obviously. Not that the others are socialists. Arguably, I would argue that socialism has never existed in Israel, apart from a short time in the 60s when Matzpen was a powerful force in argument, but not in numbers. And obviously an anti-Zionist group of revolutionary socialists, you know, a number of us, Hagit and myself, belong to it, and probably many others who are listening. What instead unites those two? I explained what separates them. The first thing is the IDF. More than anything, both support the IDF and the security organizations, many of them, that guarantee the subjection of Palestine and Palestinians. Even people who have not served in the IDF see it as the main machinery of change. It formed modern Israel in the first place. Ben-Gurion used it as the machinery to form Israeli identity. And they want to use it, and they can use it because what I said about the young people that never lived in a non-occupation country, they can use it and they will use it. Now, their Jewish identity is an exclusivist identity. much more strict than the first group, but both of them support a Jewish identity which does not accept non-Jews in Palestine. So basically they support Nakba too, but they debate what the best way to do it. One side says, let's do it quietly and people won't notice. And the other side says, no, let's just cut the whole thing. Let's do it in one, read the report I submitted to you in the chat. That's how they want to do it. Now, both of them are anti-Arab, Islamophobic. They have deep hostility to ideas of social equality. Last but not least, they are fully committed to the Zionist settler colonial project, to apartheid, and to the control of the whole of Palestine. That is why Palestinians are not that welcome and at the demonstrations. The Palestinian flag is not welcome, is disallowed actually. And that's why the few Palestinians that ventured and spoke were censored. They were told what not to say and also what to say. And if they veered from that, they were censored. Now I'm coming to my conclusion. What position should people like us take vis-a-vis this? I think we should realize that having hundreds of thousands of people in the streets is an opportunity to introduce into the air ideas that before that, Hagit, are you telling me the 2 minutes? I don't hear you anyway. The opportunity is there to organize people who are on the verges of such crowds to go to demonstrations with Palestinian flags, to argue. And this is now becoming not the usual slogan, but a very strong slogan of the demonstrations, which is one democracy for all from the river to the sea. This is the one state democratic solution, yeah? No one before this period ever voiced it. So despite all that I said, and because of all that we know, we must use the historical opportunity to undermine Zionism and the militarized nature of it. So if we can actually plant in people's minds the idea that the solution to the conflict can be and is and will be a single democratic state for all its citizens that treats the Nakba as a crime, and not just in terms of apology, but in terms of reversing the results, allowing refugees to come back to Palestine, obviously not to their homes because they were destroyed, but looks after them. That is better than the wars that Israel has fought, which is, Israel fought more wars since 1948 than any other country on earth. So Israeli Jews, are not having it that good in terms of peace. And they persuaded themselves that Dayan was right, that we have to live with the sword in our hand or we will lose the country. They persuaded themselves. Now we are there to persuade them of the opposite and hopefully bring it about sometime. Don't know if in my lifetime. So coalitions are being set up between mainstream organizations and radical ones, Palestinian, Mizrahi, feminist, environmentalist, human rights, etc. There are opportunities for speaking about a progressive agenda. And I think this meeting is part of it, yeah? And in the United States, JVP is doing an amazing job for the last 20 years of bringing that progressive message to the American Jews. And now the American Jews understand that what they are seeing is an abomination, and most of them don't want to have anything to do with it if it goes on. This is quite a change, and this change needs to happen here and in Europe, and we are a long way from it. And this is a reason for those meetings. And this is a chance to present a Palestinian point of view to the revolt, to the demonstrations. They have never listened to the Palestinian point of view. There was no channel for the Palestinians. It's not allowed to be expressed in terms of activity, in action and change. And I hope that you don't think that I'm too optimistic, because I'm not. I'm not an optimist, but the optimism of the will, as Gramsci reminded us, is very necessary for those of us that totally reject the settler colonial realities of Israel, reject the suppression of Palestinian identity, reject this stealing of land, reject all those things, but also reject some of the Israeli ailments, the inequality, the treatment of Mizrahim and Ethiopians and so on. I'm not, of course, not talking about the Palestinian Israeli citizens. It goes without saying. So all of us are invited, are advised, I think, to move to another mode of operation where we can argue our case, which we were not allowed to before, to introduce a left-wing progressive agenda, which is anti-racist, anti-colonial, and in a sense, revolutionary, but this is a revolutionary time in Israel. I think we have to understand that there are points in history that change is possible. It's not guaranteed, never, it is not guaranteed ever. But with enough action, with enough pressure, with enough commitment, we can do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Haim. And people will have a chance to ask questions later in the chat. I would like to introduce our second speaker, who's Raef Zreik. Raef is a professor of jurisprudence at Ono Academic College and a senior researcher at the Leer Institute. He's currently a visiting fellow at Harvard Divinity School, and in fact is joining us from Cambridge. Between 2010, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and between 2010 and 2022, he was the academic co-director of the Minerva Center of the Humanities at Tel Aviv University. He's a graduate of the Hebrew University, Columbia University, and Harvard Law School. And his main areas of research and writing include legal and political philosophy, Zionism, Israel-Palestine, and citizenship studies. Most recently, his most recent book is titled Kant's Struggle for Autonomy on the Structure of Practical Reason, and it's just come out this year from Rowman-Littlefield. And Raef, I pass the floor to you.
Yes, thank you all. I assume you can hear me, right? Yeah, okay. Thank you for this invitation. Thank you for holding this important event. Thank you, Haim, and thank you, Hagit, for these introductory remarks. And I will try to be in part more specific, given that Haim offered us sort of a very social, political, historical overview. So I'm finding myself doing what usually I don't do, which is usually to try to locate the legal in a wider historical and political frame. Probably I would be in part, I'll be zooming in instead of zooming out. Sometimes I also would go back and do some zooming out. One of the striking things, I think, talking or discussing about what's going on in Israel is the following fact. On the one hand, there's clearly some divide in Israel. Demonstration going for 3 months with this energy is remarkable. We haven't witnessed that. And the division is not, let's say, completely superficial. Though there are really many things that unite both parties, there's still a division. And on the other hand, looking from Palestinian perspective, this total division or this total controversy, deep controversy in Israel, seems to be from Palestinian point of view as almost completely marginal, almost completely not able to touch the deep structure of the relation of the Palestinian with the Israelis. So here is something that really requires some contemplation, if not some explanation, how to put together the sense of serious divide along the feeling that it's only marginal. Or let's ask the question, in what sense there's something new going on in Israel, or is just more of the same since the beginning of the Zionist project? How can we be faithful in describing what's going on, both in terms of continuity, because this doesn't happen just out of the blue, and on the other hand, how can we be able to discern that there is certain threshold probably is being crossed? And this is in part what I would try to attempt to do. And I'll attempt to do that in part by looking on some minor details in the picture. One way to describe what's going on is simply through settler colonial paradigm. The problem with the settler colonial paradigm, like every other paradigm that try to explain everything, Marxist paradigm, that explains everything as class struggle, is that one might probably try to explain everything as this is a stage in the settler colonial project, which is true. This is a stage, a new stage in the settler colonial project. But I think that's the framework of the discussion or the analysis, but it cannot consume all of the analysis. And one should look on minor details and in the global picture at the same time. So, but let me say a few technical things that probably are important for those who are not versed in the exact discussion in the minor details about the constitutional revolution that's going on. What is all about in terms of the technical proposals? First of all, it's really changing lots of the inter-Jewish Israeli game. It's not a minor change in this regard. Looking from it internally is just, it's not only change in the way that judges are appointed, the Chief Justice is appointed. It includes an overriding clause that means that the Knesset actually can override any decision by the court. It's abolishing the reason for the reasonableness sort of idea of judicial review that the court can strike down administrative action whenever it's not legally reasonable, which was the main actually tool for the Supreme Court to intervene in administrative action. The suggestion or the law that is being put to the Knesset that actually the Supreme Court cannot review what's called basic laws, changing the status of legal advisors so that they become only as sort of a personal legal advisors, that you can dismiss their legal opinion. And these are just part of the proposals. When all the proposals are being put together, for those participating in the system, this is a huge change in the system. It's a huge change in the system. It amounts to ruling without rules. Really, it's amount to ruling without rules. Now, ruling without rules has been the case all the time if you're under military rule, because military rule, the rule is the permanent exception and the arbitrary power, actually, of not to say the military commander, even for any soldier in any roadblock. But now there is sort of an expansion of the idea of ruling without rules, from being limited to the West Bank to being sort of the mode of operandi in the Israeli state at all. So for those who are participating in the game, this is quite a change. Some other change, which I don't think it's insignificant, and I'm here, given the background that Haim gave, I would like to amplify. Had he done otherwise, I would amplify the other way. I think that historically, the legal system, the law in Israel, and that's not only about Israel, the legal system in Israel was being in the service of the Jewish state, in the service of the Jewish people. And in that sense, it hasn't been neutral. It hasn't been neutral between its Jewish people and the non-Jews. So it's probably neutral between the Jewish people themselves somehow, not fully, because it's tilted toward those who have against those who have not, the wealthy against the poor. But at least rhetorically, it's in the service of the Jewish people. The Palestinian didn't experience the neutrality of the law. They actually more experienced the fact that the law was against them. Sometimes it defended them. But that's the nature of the law. Sometimes it defends even those who are the victims of the law. Still, I think in this regard, we might be witnessing, if this constitutional revolution will succeed, we'll be witnessing a change in the sense that more and more the law is in the service of the government. The law is not in the service of the Jewish state. And that means that more and more Jews would be the victims of the law. And again, this has been the case with the Palestinians, but now we see by the fact that it is becoming, the law become associated with one interpretation of what does it mean to have a Jewish state, and subjugating the logic, the legal logic, to the government, not to the logic of statehood. I think this is something might be something new and reveals a new stage in the structure, in the constitutional structure of the Jewish state. Again, looking from Palestinian point of view, is just the extension of the way that the law was practiced in a clearly exceptionalized way vis-a-vis the Palestinian. Now this exception is devouring the legal system, so that the arbitrary nature of the legal system becomes more and more dominant. So in this sense, probably one should see that there is something new. Now, it's all against the background of the history of Zionism as we know it. Now, who are the powers that are leading for this counter-revolution or revolution? And here I think there are so many stories to tell, and I think Haim told many of them. The division is not one division, it's so many divisions. One way one can say it's fascist against mainstream pseudo-liberals. One can say it's probably Mizrahiyyin versus Ashkenazim, on another middle class versus poor, Tel Aviv versus the surroundings, third generation, sort of the grandson of the first settlers compared to the sons of the second generation of settlers. Sometimes it's secularist versus religious. And sometimes those who support a certain compromise with the Palestinians against those who are completely against any compromise with the Palestinian. So here to elaborate the picture that Haim was portraying, clearly those who are opposing and demonstrating, probably most of them are not for any compromise with the Palestinian, but some of them are actually. But those who are in the government, none of them for any kind of compromise with the Palestinian. So that makes, probably there's still a difference on the margins, but it's a difference. How much one can count on that difference? Probably not much, but probably there is some space for intervention that Haim alluded by the end of his talk, and something that I would refer to myself by the end of my. So there are so many ways to tell the story of what's going on. In the immediate level, at the level of contingency, I think there are two immediate powers that are very much interested in this change. One is Netanyahu, personally, and one shouldn't underestimate the fact that Netanyahu is interested in this attack on the legal system for his personal issues. So this is one. Second, the Orthodox groups who have been suffering for a long time, let's say, from the Supreme Court. And let's be frank about it. Israel, in many ways, is more, let's say, when it comes to issues of religion and state, there are several leading court decisions that really could be construed to be against the religious Orthodox groups. So they have good reasons, actually, to take a position against some of the Supreme Court rulings. So Israel's story is, in a part, Israel is becoming more religious and less religious at the same time. So the story here is a little bit complicated. And those groups on the right wing feel that actually the Supreme Court and the legal system in general, given that after the last 40 years, the right wing have been winning all elections. So in terms of potential for change through democracy, the left wing is not able to offer any impact on the Israeli society. So part of what the Israeli center left have been doing in the last 3 decades is relying on the Supreme Court in order actually to infuse Israel with some residue of some minimal liberal values that are within the Israeli society itself. So in a situation when the politics itself, parliamentary politics, is moving to the right, the center liberal is using the Supreme Court as the last battle that, or the last resort for its own politics. So that makes the Supreme Court the site of hostility for most people on the center right and religious conservative people. So this is this is something that, in part, and add to that, the really hostility between Shas and especially there, a long story with the Supreme Court is simply delivering time after time decision against Deray. But this is more, let's say, one of them is contingency, the other is sort of more a historical contingency. But probably the overall picture is the overall picture of the really national religious right-wing fascism that is growing, and mainly in the last 12 years since Netanyahu in power. But the root, the seeds for that has been, for decades, has been there. And one of its manifestation actually is the passing of the Nationality Basic Law in 2018, which announced actually the beginning of a new era, I think. And many of us wrote about the passing of this law and the meaning of that law, which really symbolizes a new threshold in the relation of the settler project. I mean, for some time, even at the level of lip service since Oslo, after Oslo, they were talking about two-state solution. Even Netanyahu at one point mentioned the two-state solution. We all knew that he didn't mean anything in that term, is just smoke screen, but at least he paid some lip service, and he tried to actually to deploy that discourse in order to show that Israel has its own plan for the solution of the conflict. Never really intended to implement that plan. And then we have years of managing the conflict. And I think the last 10 years, we've witnessed the language of managing the conflict. And I think that we've slowly but steadily, with the expansion of the settlements in the West Bank, where the settlements are not anymore neither military, nor temporal, and nor ideological. In that sense, there is an ongoing normalization of the existence of the settlements in the West Bank, so that the settlements are more and more are part of Israel, clearly part of Israel. So the idea of separation, even separation that is based on racist ideology, like the Oslo separation, is not possible anymore. But what is, one might say, the positive side about ideas of separation that emanates from Oslo? It's based on idea of geographical separation. Now, when the settlements project reaches this level of intensity, that geographical separation is not a possibility anymore. So what do you have if you want to continue to hold the West Bank at the same time? The only possibility that you have is one either of two. One is a separation that is, let's say, instead of horizontal separation, is just a vertical separation, where you have two people. It's just one is superior to the other. That is just declared apartheid, where the Jews, wherever they are, they have privileges, and Palestinian, wherever they are, that is not only in the West Bank, but also inside Israel, they are, at the best case scenario, a second-class citizen. Now, you need an ideology and you need a constitutional structure that actually reflects this reality and turns it from just mere contingent legal piecemeal arrangement into a structural arrangement where really the Palestinians should be completely defeated, their national rights completely abolished, and simply to give them the chance, either they accept Jewish supremacy or there should be ethnic cleansing and there should be expelled. So in the overall, probably that is the wider frame in which one should view this overall project, or this overall constitutional revolution that is taking place, so that we've reached the point that Israel have been constituting a colony, and now the point where the colony should colonize the constitution itself, so that the West Bank is the logic of the West Bank and apartheid and colonization in the West Bank is becoming the organizing logic of the state in itself, in a way that it's not only moving the logic from Israel to the West Bank, it's the logic of the West Bank also moving back into inside Israel. But this is an overall logic that could have, one could ask, but why now? It could have happened probably 10 years from now or 15 years. I think here's the only answer is that sometimes it's just contingency that the Netanyahu trial that is simply accelerated the undercurrent of these events and brought them to the surface. So it's a contingency that allowed necessity to appear, actually. So the necessity where all the time is going on in there. And it's just now it's become more crystal clear. The other aspect to that, and this probably is there's something unique about the constitutional structure of Israel that invited this kind of a crisis to appear in the way that it is appearing. It could have appeared in another way. And the constitutional story, I'm not here in the position to tell the story of Israeli constitutionalism, but what I would like to say is the following. Is that for so many reasons, one of them because of Israel is basically a movement. It's not simply a state, because state is static. Israel is all the time a movement in the process of expansion, and its population is never determined. It's all the time in the process of absorbing new Jews. So Israel is a state of expansion, of settlement, and of movement all the time. And this reflects itself not only in geography, in the idea of the frontier, the expansion of contested where is the border, but also in terms of political structure. Israel doesn't know the idea of border, of limit. So Israel doesn't have a written, rigid, formal constitution, and probably that is not accident, because it's the nature of Israeli sovereignty that doesn't want to have any limits on itself. Now, this has ever created a very specific constellation of Israeli constitutionalism, where the Knesset in itself has three hats at the same time. The hat of the Constituent Assembly that can make constitution and has the power to amend the constitution, and at the same time, it's the legislative. And in Israel, even it has the fourth power that it elects the government. Now, what does that mean? That means that we have four institutions collapsing into one constitution. The same body that makes constitution is the one that changes the constitution and the one that makes everyday laws. So you can, if you want to make a law that actually changes, let's say, the fines on those who travel over speed of 100, it's the same legal procedure if you want to change the basic constitutional arrangements in Israel. It's the same procedure with majority of 2-1. Just 2 Knesset members against 1. And at the same time, it's controlled by the government, because in Israel, as a parliamentary democracy, who controls the Knesset also controls the government. Now, this gives us that we have 4 main bodies in just one body. That means that if you have a constitutional structure like the US, where there's a frame of higher politics that actually sets the rules of the game within which the everyday politics is taking place, in Israel, there's no such division. The frame and the game are the same. So there's no division between higher level politics in the sense of politics, of constitutional politics, where the constituent body legislates the constitution for the future generation without knowing where one would stand on these issues. It's not separate from the immediate interest-based legislation. Now, this is what that means, that everything is for grab all the time. That means that you can change the rules of the game while you're playing the game at the same time. This is what allowed the specific problem, the specific constitutional crisis that we're witnessing at this exact moment. And this is probably could be attributed to the nature of the Israeli state as an ongoing settler project in itself. But that is the immediate constellation, constitutional constellation, that actually can explain why all of a sudden, it's not that there is such a controversy over these constitutional issues, but actually there are no agreed rules on how to adjudicate this controversy. This lack of agreed rule on how to resolve controversy on constitutional matters when they appear actually reveals the depth of this crisis. Now, I want to end. I agree completely with Haim that this is probably a good time to offer some horizon. And I think, despite the fact that most of those who are participating in the demonstrations, raising Israeli flag, committed to Zionism and to committed to the Jewish state and supremacy, that's in itself shouldn't prohibit us to think that they actually, during the events, one can change one's mind. Sometimes our feet going to demonstration, clashing with fascists, can change our ideas. So sometimes the feet do what the minds still is not conceiving. Because simply confronting fascism can all of a sudden bring to mind all kinds of questions that until now were frozen. The beautiful thing, and I say use the word beautiful, about what is going on is that we're witnessing a moment that could be a moment of unfreezing of certain questions that we're taking for granted. And this is probably the moment to ask, to put on the table, using the fact that people are thinking about the essential of what does it mean to have Jewish existence in Palestine, that there might be an opening, and to ask question, what does it mean to solve the Jewish questions after all? And what is the nature of democracy and colonialism? What is the nature of the internal question of Israel constitutionalism with the external question of occupation? What are the structural requirements that can guarantee on the long run a democratization and liberalization of Israel? What is the nature of the relation of the fact that ruling without rule? Is there a relation between ruling without rule in the West Bank and ruling without rule inside Israel? In what sense can the rule of law be divided between Israelis and Palestinians? And in this sense, one can only offer to push the internal critique of the dynamics that is existing on the margin of those protesters, and to pose to them a question that force them to widen and enlarge their political imagination. That's the hope. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Raef. And we are now opening the floor for questions. Please, everybody, send your questions to me, and I will do my best to to give everybody a chance to talk and to diversify as much as possible the topics. We have one question from Jonathan Chadwick. I'm not sure I see Jonathan, whether you're here and whether you would like to ask your question in person. Please feel free to turn on your video.
No, I think the question speaks for itself, really. It's just to do with the fact that the whole of this, the story, this process that's going on in Israel could be looked at from the point of view of the development of the stages of settler colonialism, but equally the whole process of the genocidal process against the Palestinians could be seen to be the only thing that can possibly hold Israeli society together. And so therefore the process could be looked at as another stage in that genocidal process. I mean, I suppose it's just really to do with the fact, does the Israeli state really need the Tel Aviv liberal intelligentsia? Perhaps that's not quite the right characterization of it, since it is involved in the army. But the question stands for itself, I think.
Yeah, but nobody, I'm the only one who saw the question, so maybe you can repeat it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I mean, I put it in the chat.
Yes, but the chat went to Haim, and then Haim forwarded it to me. It didn't go to everybody.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. That's quite confusing.
Would you like me to read it?
Well, yeah, I think that's probably the best idea. I'm sorry. Yeah, I just have to make the best of it.
So the question is, to what extent is it, I imagine you were talking about the present demonstrations, to what extent is it a stage in a genocidal project vis-a-vis the work of Daniel Feierstein, as well as a stage in the settler colonialist project? What is the relationship between these two processes? And so, Raef or Haim, would one of you like to answer this?
I could start. I think the two processes are one, in a sense. Of course, in order to take over Palestine, you need to use genocidal and ethnic cleansing methods. They were used even before 1948, during the British Mandate, from 36 to 39, when the Palestinians arose against the British and against Zionism. They've been used ever since. Now, the rationale is very simple. We don't mind so much the Palestinians, but they can't live in Palestine. That's the one thing they cannot do, is live in the same space, political space, physical space, economic space, cultural space that we live in. Because we are a Jewish state, and we have a right to the whole of Palestine. In that, I do not think that both sides disagree. They disagree about the methods, about the speed, for example, they disagree. And about doing things in a way that looks better abroad. That's an important part of the Tel Aviv story. And the Jerusalem story is, no, we don't care about goys. This is going back to something that Ben Gurion and others have said. The goys are I don't know what's happened here, but somebody's... we need to see them as basically what Raef just described at the end. I mean, to empty Palestine of Palestinians is the job of Zionism. I don't actually talk about Israel, I'm talking about Zionism, because both of those are Zionists. And remember that the Nakba wasn't done by the right, it was done by the left. So we shouldn't actually forget that and say, oh, these are fascists, and these are people that want to do, you know, a genocide and ethnic cleansing. Well, both sides are involved in this. In 1967, 250,000 people, 250,000 Palestinians were expelled by the IDF within 3 weeks. So this was a kind of trial run of Nakba 2. The proposal, can I share the screen a second, Hagit?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Okay, this is the plan, the Smotrich plan. This is a tiny bit of it. What will happen when they are in power? He wrote it in 2017. This will open, this is verbatim. This will open 2 alternatives for the Palestinians. Those who are ready to give up national self-determination will be able to stay and live there and enjoy the great plenty, progress, and excellence brought by the Jewish people. They will be residents rather than citizens, without the rights to vote and be voted and voted for, and without rights of self-determination. Those who are not ready for this will have to leave to one of the many Arab countries or somewhere else, and we will help them to do so. And the second one, I will only read the first sentence. He calls it refuses. Those who will refuse to leave and will choose the third option of violence against the IDF will be dealt with by the security forces much more resolutely than we do today, and in better conditions for us. The permanent solution, remember, must be built on the total removal of the Arab hope for a state between the river and the sea. So I'll stop the share. Read the plan, read the full plan. This is the first time that Zionism is actually producing a plan in writing and saying openly what it means to do. Normally, they had plans, of course, but they kept them secret. In 1967, in July, they had a very large plan on how to control the territories, but they never revealed it. So when somebody publishes something like this, I think it merits careful reading, because they mean to do exactly what they say. And one of the sentences, and I'll end with that, is the army is strong and efficient and will kill those that need killing. I think, the use of words says it all.
Thank you very much, Haim. And I'd like to ask Abe Haim, if you're there, if you would like to ask your question, or I could read it if you would prefer that. So Abe is asking, is it not possible that Israel is a dystopia that cannot be clarified or classified, and is so deliberately ambiguous that it leaves Israel able to, as Raef had described, just change the rules by minute by minute, to the extent of never adhering to any aspect of ethical, humanitarian, or international law? Raef, perhaps you want to comment on this?
I don't know if I want to make sort of a gross absolute generalization that it can never adhere to anything in international or, but we don't need that. What we're witnessing is actually a movement that doesn't work within a frame, a legal frame, a movement that doesn't want to set border. It's a movement that is all the time excited from the fact that it can exert power and to achieve something by power. And this is probably the tragedy of Zionism, is that it doesn't know where to stop, actually. It's all the time has this thrill of achieving things through power, all the time through power, and doesn't know its limits. Now, if you don't know your limits, then you're keep expanding and you keep escalating violence time after time. And I think this is definitely characteristic of Israel. But when it would know the limits of power, when it's faced with another power, and that probably can bring Israel to change. I don't think, I don't subscribe to completely essentialist, absolutist theories of history about the nature of, even of Zionism. I think had Zionism been faced with a more powerful Arab resistance and American sort of more clear policy against settlements and expansion, it could have ended otherwise. Simply, they're all the time testing the limits of power, and as long there is no limit, they keep exceeding that limit.
Thank you. We have Abrar Siraj. Would you like to ask a question, Abrar, or would you like me to? Yeah, I can read the question. We are all human beings, and our priorities are almost identical. Could this be the only way to resolve matters rather than focusing on identities manufactured during the course of human existence due to frivolous differences or even irrational differences? Haim or Raef, would you like to comment on this?
Of course, you're right, Abrar. We are all human beings, but not all of us act in the same manner, and not all of us think that we are equal. The problem with Zionism is that it was, from the start, an apartheid movement. From the start, it did not accept the existence of non-Jews in Palestine. Please go to the uncensored edition of the Diaries of Theodor Herzl and read. I'll send a link in a minute. Read his diary in June of 1895. He already there, because the diary was secret and he didn't think it will be published, and it was only published 22 years after his death, and then it was censored heavily, and what I'm going to say now wasn't included. But let me tell you what he says. It's June 12th, 1895. When we occupy the land, we shall bring immediate benefit to the state that receives us. We must expropriate gently and privately and the private property on the estates assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by producing employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country. The property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. Let the owners of immovable property, meaning land, believe that they are cheating us, selling us things for more than they are worth. But we are not going to sell them anything back. So this, in a sense, tells you that 125 years ago, already the what Raef called the framework, or the framework of the settler colonial conflict and the settler colonial settlement project were already outlined by the father of Zionism, who is a right-wing liberal. And he wouldn't have any of them, and he would help them, of course, to leave, as we can read in the current Smotrich. He is very nice. You will help them. You'll give them the tickets and so on to disappear from his beautiful Jewish paradise. I think that's the problem. We cannot actually, on one side, say we are all human beings, and when the other side is actually not believing that. We have to persuade them persuade the majority, not those people who are actually saying those things, but to persuade the majority that, like in South Africa, it's better to end apartheid. It's better to end occupation. It's better to end illegalities. It's better to end war crimes than continue with them. That's a very difficult process.
Raef, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah. Very shortly. I just want to invite you, Abrar, to listen to the leaders of South Africa in the 60s, the leaders of apartheid. Their argument on separation and segregation was based on the idea of human equality. They said that actually God created us equal but different, and the way for us to prosper is that actually each one should prosper his own way with his own community. So what I want to say by that is that the concept or the idea of humanity or human nature is too abstract, it's too general, it's too indeterminate to allow us to deduce from it any political, concrete, institutional arrangement. And it could be interpreted so many ways that beneath the general concept, there are so many different conceptions. Between the one, there is a plurality of ways of being human that render the concept of humanity as rather vacuous.
Thank you very much, Raef. The next question is Oren Iftachel has a question specifically to Raef. And Oren, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Hagit, Haim, and Raef, for very interesting presentations. And I have much to say about what you said, but I would like to narrow it to a question which relates to the end of settler colonialism. Now, Haim and my long debates over with Patrick Wolf was quite deterministic in a way that settler colonialism continues and continues. And I very much like Raef's idea or framing that it continues until its power is exhausted. And there is not predetermined point. And I think perhaps relating it to the current protest, perhaps, I'm not particularly optimistic, but there is a possibility that there is a constellation of powers now that might stop the progress, the march of settler colonialism to dispossess and colonize the Palestinians. I'd like to look at history at Northern Ireland, at Southern United States, at Colombia, at South Africa, many settler colonial projects that encountered power that ended them at some stage through politics, through marching, through initiatives, through entrepreneurs, through international pressures. Now, Israel so far has been defended and protected and cushioned by the American empire, but that also shows some signs of abating. And in this kind of puzzle, there is an Israeli opposition now, I agree with Hagit, that is unprecedented. It's not enough to unsettle the colonial project, but it is unprecedented. And as a participant to see hundreds of thousands of people chanting democracy, it has some responsibility in those chants. It's not an empty slogan. However, it hasn't included the Palestinians yet. And I want to ask Raef, I think the most interesting puzzle at this moment is Palestinian politics. And it is, to some extent, and I'm also involved in it, very frustrating that Palestinians see themselves totally on the sideline. And there's a range of reasons, of course, that they can be, reluctant to join something with like Haim rightly said, with 1 million Israeli flags and with all kind of generals standing on stage. But there's not only generals. In Beersheba, 16 weeks, I think 13 weeks of those, there were Palestinian speakers talking about there is a Palestinian people, answering to Smotrich when he said there is no Palestinian people. There are, house demolition, there is occupation, they're talking truth to power. And also in Haifa, there's quite a few Palestinian speakers. And so it is surprising in a way that the Palestinian public in Israel and also in the West Bank and Gaza are very reluctant to join. And we know that sometimes goals of protest change while they're happening. You know, Gramsci told us about rearticulation of struggles. So I want to hear from Raef, what's his take about this reluctance of Palestinians to join, and whether there are some openings or some maneuvers that can happen with the leaders of the Israeli Jewish protests that can actually enlarge the camp to an extent that perhaps there will be a structural change in the colonial system.
Thank you, Oren. Thank you for coming, and thank you for definitely for asking, which is really the extremely important question for the Palestinians. On the one hand, you can imagine why Palestinians really don't feel comfortable with ease joining such a demonstration that actually re-establish their absence, because within the sea of Israeli flags, it's really very difficult to participate in such demonstration. But one should zoom out and to see that the political arena is not constituted by the polarity of the demonstrators and the government. One should open the spectrum and create a third polarity. For example, and this is what I expect that Palestinians can do, and mainly Palestinians in Israel. Palestinians in the West Bank are mainly counting their dead bodies. So it's really too demanding for them to expect from them to sort of to interact with what's going on. But Palestinians in Israel, I think I expect from them to do something that not necessarily joining the demonstration, but actually to influence the demonstrators from the outside. I'll give you an example. Why not to make a study day, a small conference in Nazareth, with the presence of those people who are on the left democratic sides of the demonstrators, for example, in the sense to open with them a dialogue that actually says that the options are not either to be with the government nor to keep the status quo. We're hoping actually to move the status quo to make it more democratic and more inclusive, not only for the Palestinians in Israel, but probably for the Palestinians in the West Bank. And in this sense, their contribution would be to show the internal contradiction or the limits of the protesters' logic themselves, in the sense, if you really are sincere about democracy, there are certain things that you have to do on the long run, because assume that you win and completely the government would declare that there is no constitutional revolution. Okay, so what? The next day, new government, new constellation of power cannot continue to control the West Bank and to continue to be democratic in Tel Aviv. Now, this language should be analyzed empirically, not as a preaching. I don't like the slogan, the Marxist slogan, that a nation that actually subjugates other nation in itself cannot be free. I don't like it because of its moralistic tone, in the sense that actually Britain subjugated India for a long time, and it wasn't clear that England in itself didn't have some level of liberal rule. But in case of Israel, it's becomes empirically impossible to do both of those. And in this sense, I think that we do have, first of all, to our Palestinian nation, but also to our fellow citizens, that to show an option, a horizon. I mean, the right wing said clearly what is their vision. Our vision is Jewish supremacy, that there are one nation over the other nation. Now, the center liberal, if you want to call it, doesn't have a vision. In many ways, shares the vision of the fascists, but in a more modest way. And it's part of our role is to say, look, actually there are two visions. Either you have a binational equal states that gives equality to both nations as individual and as a collectivist. Otherwise, you will end up being a Smotrich. And we're giving you the vision that is binationalistic equal. In this sense, the Palestinians should be a third pole in this conversation, and that way to stretch the vocabulary of the conversation. That's the role that I think they can play in this game. We don't hear you, Hagit.
Yes, I know. Thank you very much, Raef, and thank you very much, Haim, and everybody else. I think this is time to wrap up this meeting, and I want to echo a number of people who sent me in the chat. Thank you for both of our excellent speakers. And we end at this point, and I just want to say before we end that we heard from both speakers and also from Oren, and I think maybe I said this as well, that we all very much hope that there would be something within the present protest that would allow for some kind of a crack through which some message or some change could actually get through that would be a real change as opposed to one that may not be sufficient, at least from our perspective. And I wish you all a very good evening, and thank you very much for attending. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all. And thank you, Hagit.
Well, thank you.
We must thank you very much.